And then we'll have some more training presentations, followed by lunch. And then at 2 o'clock, there is a separate presentation, also in the same room and same Zoom room, which is a beginner training featuring Mia and Sam. And then the beginner training will go from 2 to 4. But thank you very much to David and Quentin for organizing DOCACON 2023. And also Bryce for helping. The theme of LitCon yesterday, I hope most of you were able to see LitCon, was collaboration at scale. And I like to think that docassemble as a open source software product is an example of collaboration at scale. There are 46 different contributors to the docassemble code base, which, you could say that's not really scale, but I think it's scale. I think that's an example. And really anybody can be a contributor to the docassemble code base by, contributing a recipe to the documentation, or making edits to all the typos that I put into the documentation when you find them, or suggesting a feature. I think one part of collaboration at scale for docassemble is just the Slack community and people who have questions and ideas for new features. So anyway, I will get started with the first presentation, which is mine, where I will talk about how to use external data sources. And if anybody in the remote room has any feedback on how the tech is going, please make sure to make a comment on Zoom. And if you want to find the PowerPoint, there's a link down here. So one of the nice things about having Python at your disposal when you're writing a guided interview is that you can use all of Python's tools for accessing external data sources. And just as some background for this presentation, if you're new to coding, new to docassemble, you represent a list in Python. Like if you want a list of things with these square brackets, and then you want to reference a list element, you use square brackets 0, 1, 2, 3 to refer to an item. In YAML, that's represented with little hyphens as bullet points. And then there's a data structure in Python called a dictionary, which is just a key value pair. So fruit is apple, vegetable is potato, and that's represented with curly brackets. And you reference a particular item in a similar way to the list, except you use a string. And the way that YAML has dictionaries are organized is with colons. And then you can have nested data structures like a list of dictionaries, which is formatted in YAML like that, kind of like a combination of the two things I showed. You can have a dictionary of lists. You can have all sorts of nested data structures that will hurt your brain trying to think about them. And you can represent them in both Python and YAML. All right, so the example that I am going to start with is, suppose I have an interview and I want to know the prothonotary in each county in Pennsylvania. And for those not in Pennsylvania, prothonotary means court clerk. And I want to have an interview where there's a drop-down list of the counties in Pennsylvania, and then it tells me who the court clerk prothonotary is in that county. And I have all of this data in a spreadsheet that I pulled from the internet. But I want to have it in a docassemble interview. So one way to do it would be to write some code making a list of dictionaries where each item in the list has information about the county and the name of the prothonotary and their address. And then I can access that in the interview using some Python code for the pull-down menu. So in which county do you live? And then the county for each item in this PA courts data structure that I defined. And then once I pick a county, I can loop through them and until I find the data structure, until I find the dictionary with the correct county, and then show the name of the prothonotary. Another way to show this data is in a more neat format rather than this thing, which is garbage. You never want to write code like that. But this is fairly neat. You could maintain this in your code Another thing you can do is use a data block in docassemble, which you might have seen, where you can define a bunch of data in YAML format, and it works basically the same way. You get a list of dictionaries, and I can include that pacourts.yaml file in an interview and then use it the same way. Now, you might wonder, when you're using the playground in docassemble, that there's this folder called data sources with a little database symbol. So you could put your data in there. You can actually use JSON, which is yet another format for storing data, and put the list of the prothonotarians in a JSON file, put it in the sources folder, and then access that in your docassemble interview with the objects from file block. So that's another way that you can do it. But the disadvantage of all of these methods is that they put this data structure called PA courts into the interview answers, which means that if you were to update that list after a user has started the interview, they'll still have the old list because it'll be a variable in their interview answers. And also, it's kind of inefficient to carry around this big data set in the interview answers, which it's not really an interview answer. So there is a better way to do it. And maybe this way could involve using this original spreadsheet that I had instead of converting it to code. So sure enough, you can put this Excel spreadsheet in the sources folder of package or in the playground. And then ideally you could call it something, you could use it in a fashion like this, where I've defined a function for myself called prothonotaries list, which lists out the counties. And I've defined a function for myself called prothonotary info for a particular county. So the prothonotary info for the county I chose will give me a dictionary in which prothonotary is the name of the court clerk. And so this is a convenient way to do it. And the nice thing about this is that it doesn't define any variables in my interview answers that will follow the user around throughout their session. It doesn't waste space that way. And so I won't go into details about code in this presentation, but I just want to show you the code for this so that you see that it's really just one line. And yeah, it's complicated. It's hard to write one line of code, but take heart that it is just one line. It turns out that there is a very handy package called pandas that has a function for reading an Excel spreadsheet that's organized in a table. And so with one line, I can create this variable inside of my Python module called prothonotaries, which generates a list of dictionaries, just like we saw before. And then I can have these two helper functions that do kind of the same thing you saw, create a list of counties. And then I can use that in my interview. And anytime I update the package with a new version of the spreadsheet, the users will immediately see the new updated list, regardless of when they started their session. Now, if you're the type of person who really likes comma-separated values files, you can do that too, if you really want to. I hate CSV. There's a CSV package in Python that you can use. It's kind of not that convenient. And also in pandas, just like there is a read SLSX function, there is a read CSV. So you can do it in a neater fashion using pandas. Now, all of this requires you as the developer to maintain this Excel spreadsheet and put it into your package, update the list when it changes. But suppose you don't want to do that. Suppose you want it to be somebody else's problem to update this list of prothonotaries. You could put the information into a Google Sheet, and then you could assign some non-technical person the job of keeping the Google Sheet updated. And here in Google Sheets, I've uploaded my database of court clerks, and I can write some code, which is somewhat complex, but only one page worth that accesses the Google Sheets. And I'll just sort of explain how this all works. You can consult the presentation, or I'm also going to make a recipe for this later. But the idea is that there's some code down here that calls the that uses the object DA Google API, which is a helper class that is part of docassemble for accessing the Google APIs, of which there are many. And then it calls sheet values, get spreadsheet, and it refers to the court's workbook and the Prothonotary range. And so the court's workbook is this code here that represents the Google Sheet. And you can find that in the URL when you're looking at a Google Sheet. Always inspect URLs and try to hack around with URLs. You can learn a lot that way. And then Prothonotaries is the name of a named range. So if you've ever used, I don't know if you've ever used that feature in Google Sheets. It's also a feature in Excel where you can give a name to a certain range of data. So all this what this get Prothonotaries function does is it yanks in all of the data from that spreadsheet in real time. And then I've got these helper functions like before for Prothonotaries list and Prothonotary info that call that function in real time. So the user is always getting the latest and greatest data off of Google Sheets. And the way that you set up the connection between docassemble and Google Sheets is a little bit complicated, but it is explained in the documentation. And so you shouldn't feel too overwhelmed by the process. But the basic idea is you go onto your Google account, sign up for the Google Developers Console. You might have to give your credit card, but it's probably not going to charge you anything. You then create a project. Within that project, you have to enable the APIs that you want to be used, and you need to enable the Google Sheets API. And then under credentials, you create this thing called a service account, which is really helpful because the other way to authenticate involves like directing the user to log in and going back, and it's really complicated. But service accounts are really nice and simple. They will generate this email address that represents the Google account, and it'll give you credentials when you create a service account, and you just plug those credentials as a string into your configuration, and then you can forget about it because you won't have to deal with it again. But you got to get that email address, and any Google Sheet that you want to use with your docassemble interview, you just use the regular Google Sheets sharing feature and you share it with that email address. And that gives your docassemble interview access to the Google Sheet. So there's a lot of steps involved in setting up that configuration, but it is worth the convenience of being able to access the Google Sheet. There's another way that's kind of similar to the Google Sheet, which is Airtable, which is kind of like Google Sheets, except it's more sort of professional, it's more database oriented. So you sign up for Airtable, upload a spreadsheet. Here I've uploaded my Prothonotaries list. And what's cool about Airtable is that you can have this data set and then you can have multiple views of the data set. So this was a view that's by county. So I've sorted it by something. You can also edit a view by filtering. So you can have one spreadsheet on Airtable, but then have multiple views into it, like applying different filters and sorting. And the way that you use this from the docassemble interview is actually even simpler than the Google Sheets example. You can just use an API, and docassemble has this class called DA Web for facilitating the use of APIs. So I've set the base URL to this API airtable.com/ this complicated thing, and that complicated code, again, I took from the URL when I was looking at my Airtable chart. And this is an example of creating an interview that is good for debugging APIs. Always start your interview with a question where you press the continue button, because if you do some complicated operation right when an interview starts, you'll run into some trouble. And here's another debugging tip. But first, I'll show you how I actually call the API. It looks very simple. PA_courts.get Prothonotaries. And Prothonotaries is the name of the spreadsheet tab. And what this pa-courts.get means is basically send a HTTP GET request to that URL that I mentioned before, /Pythonitaries. The Airtable API is very simple, easy to use. And then I'm doing this thing, which is a hot tip for you when you're debugging these things, is you do json.dumps with indent equals 2. That creates a nicely formatted version of JSON, because if you've ever used an API and you get this long unformatted JSON response, it's kind of annoying to read it, but you can format it with indent equals 2 and it looks really nice. And then this indent function applies markdown indentation by 4 spaces. And in markdown, if you indent by 4 spaces, that means it's code. And so you have this very nicely formatted version of the stuff you got back from the API. And then the way that I'm actually calling, there are 2 things to note about the Airtable response. One is that each record has a unique ID, which is pretty cool because it's like a unique identifier for a particular database record. It also has a created time, so like you can timestamp each row. There are powerful uses for that. And also the responses are not sorted properly. So it starts out with Erie County and then it jumps to Dauphin County. But I want the information in my dropdown to be sorted. And so the way I call that, another Airtable feature, is you use parameters of view by county. So that's how you can grab any particular view of the Airtable records.
Is that that's a view you set up?
Yeah, that's the view I set up when I started. And then you can grab a particular record by just adding a slash and then the record ID and grab that out of Airtable. I'm going to skip over some stuff because I'm running out of time.
You find it easier to use that direct query rather than look at Airtable, Python, interfaces. I'm trying to both.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
The Airtable Python interface, they have their own API package, SDK.
Quentin is informing me that, I don't know if you can hear Quentin on the microphone, but Quentin says that Airtable has a Python library. I did not know that. I should have known that.
It's not through Airtable, but it is just like a library that's
Yeah, Bryce says that the Python library might be a third-party library, but it does basically the same thing. But I guess what I wanted to show with that is calling APIs is actually really easy, and you might think it's beyond your skill set. It probably isn't, because APIs are just well documented often. So another API example is I have a wiki at work, and I've already got categories of legal problems in that wiki, and if I want to use those in an interview, I can just call the wiki's API and just grab them out. And it took me 5 minutes to read the documentation for MediaWiki's API in order to get this, and it was really easy. I'm running a little short on time, but I think we'll be okay. But I want to show you this example of the questions themselves as data. So here's a way that you can have a spreadsheet where the questions are all up here at the top. And then over here on the right, there is a sequence of advice paragraphs that may or may not be relevant under certain circumstances to go into like a letter to the client. So you could have an attorney write a series of advice paragraphs and then specify under which conditions should that paragraph be included. So only if like the answer to are you over the age of 18 is yes, and how many years of employment history you have is the answer to this. So this is a combination of yes, no, and multiple choice questions. And then you can sort of grab that spreadsheet and parse it, make yourself a data structure of questions, a data structure of responses that's machine readable, and have a fairly simple function that generates the advice based on the answers to the questions. And then actually asking the questions is like literally only this screen. You just get the question out of the spreadsheet and pose it. You pose it differently if it's a multiple choice question versus a yes/no question. And then then you've got sort of this very flexible interview that only depends on the spreadsheet that somebody created, which a non-coder could easily write a spreadsheet like this. It works under fairly simple logic, like are you over the age of 18? If you say no, then there's no advice. But if you are over the age of 18, then there's more things. And one more idea is store templates as a data set on Google Drive. Expose the user experience is they're asked which template do you want to assemble, and then ask questions that are relevant to that template. And then you get a screen with the closing letter, and it says this letter explains what you have to do. Well, in this interview, all of that data came out of Google Drive. So some advocate could maintain a Google Drive folder with a variety of Google Docs that they want to assemble. And then in the metadata, they have that description. This letter explains what you have to do. They just use Google Docs to write their template. So think of templates as a potential data source, as well as questions and also things like lists of courts. There are a couple considerations when you're using external data sources. You want to pick something that is going to be maintainable. Just because it's easy to create it at time one doesn't mean it's going to be easy to maintain it indefinitely. So think about having somebody else maintain it, maybe using a Google Sheets. It is nice to have the version control over your data sometimes. So maybe you want to use a text-based way of storing data if you want to see version control. And one downside to using things like Google Sheets and Airtable is then you're dependent on those systems being up. And it kind of sucks that your interview dies and and there's nothing you can do about it because you're depending on some third party like Google. And then also when you're using a system like Airtable or Google Sheets and you're letting non-techies edit that Google Sheet, there's the danger that maybe they'll make some change to that data set that'll break your interview. And that would really suck, right? Your users are using your interview and then suddenly it breaks. And it's because you opened up the data source to being edited by a non-techie. So having an actual Excel spreadsheet that you add to a package could be good, because then you as the developer can do quality control over it before it goes live in your production site. Anyway, so go try out some APIs. Okay, sorry I went over time there. So next on the agenda, we have Bryce.
Wonderful presentation, Jonathan. Let me open up my slides. I missed the slides at the end. Ta-da. Okay, so my name is Bryce Willey. I am a clinical fellow with the Suffolk Lit Lab, and for the past 2.5 years or so, I have been slowly learning about docassemble, doing a bunch of stuff with it, and importantly, hacking on the internals. So really just like fixing bugs, improving things about docassemble, adding new features, and all sorts of nice things. And I want all of you to do the same online. So to start off, why should you hack on docassemble's internals? So docassemble's internals are very, they're actually, there's a lot of reasons to do so. The first one is that there are some bugs in docassemble. It's a really big program and it does a ton of things, and sometimes just some bugs slip in. And if you find them, you could fix them yourself. There's really nothing stopping you, and it definitely would help Jonathan out from having to do a lot of this himself. Additionally, you can add in new features or improve the playground experience for editing docassemble. And a little bit more importantly, as you sort of hack on docassemble internally and look around in the code, you'll learn a lot more about how docassemble works, and you'll sort of pull back the curtain and see that it's really just a lot of Python. So like the more Python you're using in your docassemble interviews, the more knowledge you actually have about, or you could have about how docassemble is running internally, which in turn makes you a better docassemble developer. Additionally, anytime you like make your changes, you can always contribute them back to the main code base, and then everyone in the docassemble community can benefit from all the stuff you fix. Lastly, I sort of think it's just fun to hack around. It has the same sort of like really tangible experience of writing a docassemble interview and seeing that actually on the screen and working and running. It has that same feeling of you're changing something in the code and then you see it running, and it's exciting. There is a lot. Like I said, docassemble is a really big piece of software. It has a lot of different moving parts. This presentation is going to be a fire hose. When I first ran through it, it was about 45 minutes. I do not have 45 minutes now. And so there's a lot of things that I'm going to try and skim over. Hopefully it's still understandable to most folks. If not, don't worry about it. Don't worry about memorizing any of this. All of these concrete steps are in the documentation. And so you can definitely, so you can always go back and sort of walk through these specific steps. And even if you walk away with just knowing one additional new thing about docassemble or how to run it or how to change it, that'll be a success. So a few starting assumptions, or things I'm going to assume most of the people audience have, is some experience with docassemble. If you've written a docassemble interview before, or if you've sort of administered a docassemble server, or maybe ran your own docassemble server, it helps to sort of have a bit of background knowledge on just what docassemble is doing, especially if you're looking around inside of docassemble. And if you don't have any of these start assumptions, don't worry, sit back, relax. I have a whole bunch of links in these slides that will all be very useful for starting out. Additionally, I will assume you know a little bit of Python. Honestly, if you've made a docassemble interview, you probably know enough Python. If you know what a variable is and you know how to call a function, you know enough to start sort of poking around inside of docassemble. And you won't know everything for sure, but that's okay. You focus on the stuff that you can sort of know and understand, and that will generally be enough to start looking around the internals. Additionally, I'm going to assume that you sort of know how files and folders are generally structured on computers, since that will help a lot of things going forward. Here are a whole bunch of things that I had to cut from this session, and there are links in the slides to how to get started with like GitHub, looking around and knowing HTML, and all of some details of terminal commands and such. So we'll still be running them, but you can sort of treat them as just something you can copy paste into a terminal and it'll run and work. So the first thing you want to do when hacking on docassemble internally is that you'll want to install an editor. Can't quite edit docassemble through the playground yet. That is probably not a great feature, but you will. But if installing an editor isn't super bad, there's a ton of, honestly, you can do it in something as simple as Notepad. But I recommend something a bit more like VS Code, still very bare bones, but it has a large community around it, and there's like a lot of tutorials on how to get started with VS Code. Next, you'll need a terminal that actually you'll run the commands to start and restart and update docassemble. On Linux and Mac, you can generally use your default terminals, and on Windows, I highly recommend setting up WSL2, which stands for Windows Subsystem for Linux, which really just runs Linux on Windows, which is very nice. And that's what I'll be using for this presentation, is WS2 on my Windows laptop. And the first few steps that I've already gone through on my machine, since they take a little while to run. But the first thing you'll do is you'll just actually download docassemble. This first command installs, if you're on Linux or WSL2, it installs Git on your machine, which is the Git and GitHub, which is really just for our purposes, a tool for getting the code from GitHub onto your machine, which is what the next command does. It'll grab all of docassemble's source code from GitHub and just download it to your machine. Once we have all that code on the machine, we need to actually run it and make sure anything we change on that code will be reflected in docassemble. So we're first going to set up Docker. Docker has a whole bunch of ways to set it up, and instructions all linked here again. If you're on Windows, which I will be as I am, and if you're using WSL2, like I'm recommending, you can just follow the instructions for installing Docker on Ubuntu, and it's pretty straightforward. There's also an option for Docker Desktop, which is a little bit easier to approach. It's sort of a normal program that you might run on your Windows machine, but you got to be a bit careful because it has a few terms. You have to be a small company, under 250 people, or make less than some amount, I don't remember the exact amount of money per year. Otherwise, it's not free and you have to suddenly start paying for it. And so you have to sort of be aware of that, but either works. And if you're a smaller company or it's just you're totally fine to use Docker Desktop as well. So what even is Docker? If you've ever run docassemble, you've probably run some of these commands and you might not have any idea what they're doing, which is fair because Docker is really kind of complicated. But we can break it down, and we'll start off with just knowing that Docker is not exactly technically correct, but it's very similar to a virtual machine. So if you've ever run something like VirtualBox or VMware or Boot Camp on your Mac, where you're running a Windows machine inside of your own computer. So it's just a little Inception where you're running a computer on your computer. And a Docker is essentially doing the same thing. It's running a different computer on your own computer. And specifically, we call that the running computer that's inside of your own, a container. And I'll try and use that now so I don't have to say computer 20 times. There's also something called an image, which is all of the files that you need to actually run that container. So on this machine, which is the presenter's machine, I can open File Explorer and I can go to my C drive, and this is every single file on this computer. And that's really just all an image is it's every single file that you need to run, the container somewhere else that you can download, and it can be stored on your computer somewhere, but it's just every single file you need. Finally, there's a volume, and there are a few different types of volumes in Docker, but the one we're going to use is a bit like a flash drive. So same way in a flash drive, you can plug it into your computer and you can see some more additional files that aren't stored on your computer but are stored somewhere else. In the similar way, a Docker volume is like a little flash drive that you can plug into the container and access some files from somewhere else. In this case, it'll be files on our main computer that the container can just access from there, and only those specific files. So now that we've figured out a bit of what Docker is, and we've installed our docassemble source code, we can actually run Docker. So this first command docker pool will download the Docker image onto your container. So remember, that's all of the files that you'll need to run docassemble. And then this next command actually starts the container. You can ignore about most of this. You'll still need it, but you don't really need to understand it. But there are a few important parts. The first one is that we're going to name our container. Docker lets you give things names. The names it gives them by default are okay, but they're like combinations of adjectives and scientists, and it's just confusing and they change every time. So we're going to name ours my docassemble. And then this next line that I'm highlighting, line 7, is the actual volume. So you don't have to quite know the syntax yet, but on this left side, that's the docassemble folder. That's the folder that we downloaded a few screens ago when we ran git clone. And going back, on the right side, /temp/docassemble, that's just a folder inside of the docassemble container that now has all of the files on your computer under the docassemble folder. And so now that we have everything set up, we're gonna run wild and do a live demo do I share my whole screen? And we are not quite screen sharing yet.
You are, it's just that you don't see it on the.
Oh,
So, it only sees the, so you can,
unpin,
open the Zoom.
remove pin.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, well, okay, I just gotta go back. So we're a little bit nested, but we are screen sharing within Zoom. So first off, we'll go ahead and let's figure out something to actually change on our docassemble, on docassemble. We'll first, to make it sort of a bit simple, if you've ever used docassemble, you've probably looked at the logs at some point. The logs are really useful and they tell you like what's going on. If something ever goes wrong on docs, yes, is something not sharing. Sorry? Okay, yeah, this should be the Zoom. Cool. Sorry, we are screen sharing. But yeah, if you've ever used a docassemble server, you've probably looked at the logs before. And let's say it shows the last 30 lines by default. Let's say we want to change that to 60. So a really simple change. It might be a bit useful. We don't have to always download the whole file to look at a bit more lines. And it's pretty straightforward. So, but first off, we have to actually figure out where in docassemble to make this change. And this is where this is where I want us to, if you take away one thing from this presentation, I want you to take away the 3 components of hacking, which are exploring and navigating the code, reading the code, and then making a really surgical, small change that you need to, and just repeating each of those 3 things. And the one that's really daunting, in my opinion, is exploring and navigating the code. So let's go ahead, and I've got docassemble installed or downloaded from Git onto my machine. I'll go ahead and open up my copy of VS Code, and if you've ever looked around in the docassemble source code, there's just a lot of it. And again, docassemble is a really big program. It's doing a lot of different things, and it can be really intimidating to figure out what's happening where, and where are all of these, like where's the exact, what's happening when I visit logs, the logs URL on docassemble, what code's running when I do that. And a key thing that I use all the time when I'm trying to patch things in docassemble is whatever page I'm on, I look for some bit of text that could show me that it's likely in the source code. So we see this last line, only the last 30 lines are shown. If that's being shown on the screen, it's somewhere in the code likely, especially this very specific text line. So let's go ahead and in Visual Studio, just expand that a bit, let's search for only the last 30 lines. So we can see we come up with a few different results, and this happens a lot. You're never going to find you're rarely going to find only the one place that this particular thing is in the code. But if you kind of glance around at these first results, you'll see, okay, there's English text on the right, and oh, there's German on the left. And this is a translation file. And if you're searching for things that show up in the UI, you'll see a lot of results from different translation files in Spanish and German, etc. But you keep going and sort of glance through all of them, you'll see one that is very useful. That is logs.html. And HTML is the thing that you're looking at in your browser. So we have found it. We have found the page that actually is displaying the logs. And that's sort of a main way that you can go about navigating code like this. Starting to get a bit of echo. Now we have where logs.html is, but we need to figure out where this is just an HTML file, and it has it has a few things. If you've ever edited a docx template in docassemble, you'll see these sort of two curly braces. Looks pretty similar, and that's because the HTML is using the same templating language, Jinja, as the docx template, as your docx templates are. And so it's a lot more familiar than you might think. But we still need to figure out where the Python code actually is that uses this logs.html. So we're going to use our secret trick again, and we're going to search for logs.html. And this time we're a lot luckier. There's one place that logs.html is in the source code. And it's in this fairly long function, but if we scroll to the top, we do see it's just a Python function. If we know how Python functions work, you call them and you return something, and that's all that's happening here. Is there's Flask, which is what docassemble is running on. Whenever you visit that particular URL on your server, Flask calls the function for you and then returns the actual HTML to show to the user. And we can see right at the very bottom, render templates. If we noticed back on this page, the right above only the last 30 lines is all of the actual logs that we're looking at. All of these are the actual logs that we want to change what's being shown there. And so right above this is this text area and this Jinja template that uses the variable content. We go back to our function that's running when we visit logs. We see that the content variable is being set to content. We can sort of go up a bit, and we can see that there's just a variable in this Python function that's being set to content. Backtrack a little bit more, we can see that lines is being used to set that variable. And so we can essentially look up and see, oh, here's something called Taylor, taylor.tail, opens a file, and notably, there's the number 30 a few different times. This is our line, and this is sort of the best way that you find what you want in the docassemble code, and you sort of follow the string one line at a time. And it's really intimidating to open a 22,000 line long file, but just focus on the few lines that you're interested in, and you're good to go. So let's make our change. So we wanted to show a bit more than 30 lines. Let's show 60 lines instead. So we'll change that 30 to 60, and then we'll actually go back into the logs HTML, and we'll say that we'll tell people that we're showing 60 lines instead as well. And so now that we've made our change in docassemble, we need to actually run those changes and update our running server to use those changes. And this is sort of a bit more of bash, or a bit more command line terminal commands we're going to run. And you can copy those. You can copy those right now, but essentially they're just making another terminal inside of the Docker container that we're already running. So my docassemble and bash. And if you notice, you don't have, I'm skipping over a lot of terminal stuff right now, so don't worry. But if you notice the left side, it used to say Bryce Willey LTBW, which is the name of my laptop from Suffolk. And it now says root at this really weird string. That just means we're now inside of our running our container, which remember is a different computer. So of course it's going to say it's a different computer than my laptop. And once we're here, we'll run those few other commands, which we need to actually sort of just tell our terminal, hey, we're going to be using this version of Python, and we're going to go over to this particular folder. And from there, we're going to copy these last two commands are the most important, and they are this pip install, which actually updates. Oh, no. I can just do it there. This pip install command, which actually reinstalls all of docassemble's code. So we follow all the way through. I've got some docassemble code on my computer. It's being plugged into a volume into the Docker container. And inside the Docker container, we're telling it to take all of that code from the volume, reinstall it. in the same way that you would reinstall something like a normal program on your computer, like Firefox or Chrome, when you update it. And I believe it's still installing and successfully installed. So once we've installed it, the very last command is this touch command, which we will run right now. And that touch command just restarts docassemble such that it can use the new code. So we press the on/off button on docassemble, or the reset button, and if we wait a few seconds, we should. We'll wait a few seconds for it to reload, and we'll see that this last line will say only the last 60 lines are shown. And I don't actually know if I have 60 lines and logs on this particular instance of docassemble, because I just started it this morning. But we can go up to something like access, which has is generally a lot longer, and we'll see that it's showing a whole lot more lines than it was before. And we can see that the little bit of text that we changed there at the bottom is being shown. We have now, all of us, y'all are doing this too, have successfully made your first change to docassemble's core, which is really neat. And this is just the beginning. There's a whole lot more you can do. I've mentioned Git and I've mentioned Flask. Both of those programs go a lot more in depth, and there's a lot more detail to how they work. There are just tons of other different things in docassemble, like Pike PDF, SQL Alchemy, Redis, etc. But the good news is that even though there are all these different things, you don't have to learn all of this at once. Like I said, I've spent the last 2.5 years doing this, and I did not know anything when I started. I knew none of these programs listed on this screen right here. But each time you do, you go in, you search for what you're looking for, and you really closely read the few lines you want. Ignore everything else, ignore as much as you can, and you learn those lines, and you get a little bit more knowledge, and then you come back again, and you'll know a bit more docassemble. So I know, like I said, this is a fire hose. Feel free to reach out on Slack to either myself. Jonathan is always helpful with these sorts of things. I ask him questions about the internal code all the time. So reach out on Slack and go forth and hack. Remember, everything that is in the GitHub source code is your kingdom. Thank you.
Thanks so much for giving away all of my secrets. Now everything I do is unimpressive. All right, next we have Michelle. Michelle, you're going to be sharing through your laptop or using the browser here?
I'm not sure.
Zoom? I've got your presentation here.
Okay, I'm not sure. Did you do a copy of my presentation?
It's just a link.
Can I present on my presentation, I guess?
Well, if it's so if it is the slide deck from the Google slide deck, we can just bring that right up. If you're going to show anything live that you're doing on your computer, you should do this.
I've also got your video on the.
Okay.
Your video is also on the desktop.
Okay.
You just double click it.
All right, so then we can just
My video is also. I'll trust you. Do I trust me?
Okay, I see. There is a media object that you didn't give permission. I understand what you were saying now. Yeah. Yeah, it's the video, but it's on the desktop. So if it's actually down on the desktop, you should be good. Just advance using the keys for that. When you want your video, this is just in a browser. You want your video, it's right here. So actually, here is your thing. Here's your video.
Is this screen share including audio?
It should.
Oh, it doesn't need audio.
Doesn't need
That's
audio,
okay.
okay.
My code doesn't speak.
All right.
Okay.
This is what they're saying.
All right, so I'm gonna look at both screens at the same time because my speaker notes are on my computer, but that's okay. All right, hi everyone. I'm Michelle Bernstein. I'm a volunteer software engineer with Suffolk Lit Lab, the document assembly line project, as well as with Code for Boston. I'm going to talk about how we develop in docassemble, how we test our work, and make sure it's of its quality and safety. So I'm going to be digging into assembly line kiln, that is ALKiln, as you see on the board. It's a framework for hardening docassemble interviews using automated testing. It works with any docassemble interview, and I'm also not great on my feet in front of a crowd, so almost any humor I manage is going to be totally scripted. Fair warning. Okay, I'm going to talk about testing in general. I'm going to show you how to write an ALKiln test. I'm going to show you how to install ALKiln and then follow up with some ALKiln examples. Go on. About testing. Why? Right? Why should we test? Without testing, we're risking user pain, and that's not a small thing. A lot of our users are coming to us already under a lot of strain. They dig up their experiences to put them on the page or the screen. And then, you're going through this and you hit an error 40 minutes into a 1-hour form, and it's pretty rough. They don't usually stick around to report the error, actually. We also risk user safety. If an address isn't impounded, right, when it should be, and I learned that from all you lawyers, impounded, will the user be put in danger? Next slide. All right, so by testing the errors, you can catch the errors before they actually catch your users. You can build trust with the people that are coming to you for help, and they can get confidence in you, building a community of support, sharing the tool with other people. And that's kind of the whys and wherefores of testing. So what is testing? It's a pretty broad term, but the kind of testing I'm talking about is actually something that should look pretty familiar to you. If you've ever edited an interview and then run it to check on your code, right? You've done this kind of testing. So what do you test, right? And what is good to test? First of all, it depends on your project and it depends on your stage of development. You already do these things naturally, again, but we can be more deliberate and we can be more thorough about how we do it. Your first test, though you may not realize it, is just whether the interview loads. And you run that one every time you run an interview. As you add pages, as you add logic, your manual tests get more strategic, right? You might watch for safety issues. Is a user being given a hotline number when they need it? A good candidate for testing are, of course, bugs that have happened already, because they're going to come back and sneak back in. Other things to test are common user scenarios, common user mistakes, branching paths where the user answers one thing versus the other, and something called boundary values. For example, you're not going to test absolutely every possible value. You're not going to test whether you ask a user a different question if they're 31 versus if they're 30 years old, right? That's a useless boundary, doesn't exist. But you might make sure that you ask someone who's 17 years old different questions from someone who's 18 years old. So as your interview gets more complex, the tests build up, the uncertainties build up. Are you calculating the date correctly? Did you add the right items to a list? As you work on a new branching path, are you breaking an old one? So how do you keep track? So a lot of people have created great tools and processes to help with that. And just a spreadsheet can be very powerful. And thank you for lending me yours, Carolyn Robinson. You can track all the paths, you can make sure you're covering all your bases methodically. And it can be crucial for development, but testing all those paths every time you edit really isn't scalable. Humans just aren't built for that, right? We just barely managed it with the 209A with a dozen volunteers, but it wasn't sustainable. If nothing else, it gets really boring. And that might sound like a personal complaint, and to be fair, it is a personal complaint, but also when I'm tired and when I'm bored, I tend to lose track of what I'm doing. I run tests over and over, making mistakes, and my tests become useless. So complexity happens, and tests help us to do our best to keep complexity from actually breaking things. But how much time, how many resources, how many people can you put towards protecting your users? And there's a second slide for that up here. Okay, right. So, dramatic. ALKiln can automate testing for any docassemble interview. And this is the video. So I'm gonna hit escape and use the mouse, which I can use. That's where I can do this. So this is a slow-mo video of ALKiln filling out an interview. The basic concept is pretty simple. So try to tell that to our code base. Here it's telling Suffolk Lit Labs 209A Massachusetts restraining order what to do. Though usually this part's invisible, so you don't get to see this all the time. So ALKiln pretends to be a human. It answers with the values we give it and follows our instructions. No AI, fortunately or unfortunately. It can handle looped questions. It can handle checking for missing phrases, downloading files, and it can even check your pages for basic accessibility compliance. Our documentation lists and outlines the sets of commands you can use to run. And there's more. I'm not going to show you the whole video because I think it would get boring after a while. And don't start from beginning, just slideshow, please. Okay. All right. Okay. So you have to learn even more. What? My notes aren't showing, so I can't actually say anything. All right. So I'll be honest. Writing these tests is something new to learn, and it too takes development time. And you usually don't just write a test once and leave it. As you change your code, you're going to have to update the tests already, and we'll talk a bit about that. But it is not a whole new language. It's a limited set of commands. It gets faster as you go. And once you get the hang of it, it can save much more development time than it takes. So ALKiln can run like 10 tests in the time you can run one. Ratio is not verified, so don't time me. And the output that the tests generate can usually tell you where to find what went wrong, so you don't have to go hunting in your code. logging stuff, going through the interview over and over again. So what our users say. So far, we've got pretty good reviews. And as the great Carolyn Robinson has said of it, on top of learning docassemble, learning to build tests is a challenge, but it is so worth it. All right, so what to automate, right? Testing, manually testing in automation are a bit different, is a bit different. So that's basically a whole field, all of its own. And I'm not going to go through all of it here, and opinions differ very strongly. My first answer is maybe nothing, right? Maybe no tests. Some projects just don't need automated testing at all. An interview that's going to be set up for a week for a dozen people is probably good with a manual run-through. So that said, something that needs to be built to last, has complex logic or vulnerable users, it could use a more solid foundation than just manual tests. It still depends on the project and its stage of development. And you could choose to pour a ton of development time into testing right from the start, but don't do that. Learning what not to test is just as valuable as learning what to test. So when you're starting out with an interview, take the low-hanging fruit. Just test that the interview loads. There's a test for that. Then don't write more automated tests until your code settles down a bit. Again, when you're changing the variables, you're going to have to update your tests. But when you do have behavior that you want to pin down, that you're losing track of, your tests can scale along with the ambition of your project. So let's get technical and go through writing that first test. Does the interview load? And we'll worry about how to set up ALKiln later. It happens. It's a thing in life. And as we go through these dummy interviews I've created, please do remember that I'm not a lawyer, right? If they don't make sense, if they look like nonsense, it's because they are nonsense. So, okay. First, you create your project. You create your project and your YAML file. Then you create your test file in your sources folder. You create a file that ends in a different kind of extension, a .feature extension, and that's how ALKiln can find the files that are specifically for tests. All right, so first, in our test file, .feature file, we add the feature keyword. And I don't know where I am in my notes, but in this file, I'm going to test whether all my interviews that I run actually load. So I have letter.yaml and I have codeorder.yaml, and I'm going to try to load one right now. So we'll add the feature keyword, and then we'll add a description. What is the purpose of the test in this file? Of all the tests in the file, they will test whether each interview loads without errors. Each test then uses the keyword scenario, right? It comes with a description of the purpose of that one test. This test will start the tenant letter. Then we make our first step. Each test has a series of steps, step definitions, and we write out our first one. Given I start the interview at, quote, letter.yaml, that contains what I'm calling an ALKiln command that you can see in yellow, given I start the interview at. Then in quotes comes the part we can customize, where to start the interview, and here the file is letter.yaml. That's in quotes. And that's it. It's written as a whole. The test starts letter.yaml, and it will error if it fails to load. So let's try running it. So there are actually two ways to run the test right now, new and exciting ways. It's always been possible to run them in GitHub, but now our new shiniest feature is the ability to run them, to run a project's tests from an interview installed on your server. Shiny new feature, yeah, I could put that. There are some differences, and we'll try this shiny new feature first, and we might discuss the differences more later. So first, make sure we're signed in as the developer or an admin. We run the interview, this testing interview. We choose which project to test. Here I'm testing housing. And then we grab a coffee, right? Or since we know who we all are, we probably work on a different project. Though with just one test, this particular run isn't going to take very long. So while we stress out about something else, ALKiln will run the tests. It'll generate some files and folders, reports, screenshots, downloaded files. If there's a problem later, or just for fun, we can share the results with a supervisor or coworker. They won't have to run the test themselves. All right, finally, you can see the output. So there's a lot of information on the screen. Among other things, there's the zip that we can download with all the generated files. We see a link to the summary report right here. And there, right here, the ALKiln took a picture, right? We didn't tell it to take a picture, but when ALKiln runs into an error, it tries to take a screenshot of the last page it saw to give us as much information as possible. Okay, so we got an error. Looking at the report, ALKiln is giving us its best guess at what went wrong. It looks like it got the error that a docx file was missing. And when we redundantly look at the screenshot, we can see that is indeed the case. We forgot to upload the template file. So we fix that, run the test again, and this time it passes. And that's our first test. That's it. It wasn't a great example. It was a pretty easy bug to spot, and it was pretty easy to solve. But ALKiln does try to point out the problems that come up and where they are, so you spend less time blindly troubleshooting your code. So how do you set up the interview in the first place? So first of all, if you don't know me or Suffolk, don't use this QR code, right? That's not safe. Go to the slides later. Don't use strange QR codes. General rule. All right, so you install our package just like any other package on your server, any other GitHub package on your package management page. And just like any other interview, you can add its files to the dispatch list, and that puts it in the list of available interviews. So now I'm gonna apologize. I'm gonna mess up whatever flow I had going on, and I'm gonna shoehorn in the GitHub version 2, because, right? But if you don't use GitHub, please avert your eyes now. Turn off your ears. Okay, so running tests on the project in your playground, like we just showed, is a quicker feedback loop than GitHub. Edit, test, edit, test. But GitHub is a great way to work with the team, and you can set up scheduled tests that keep an eye on packages you depend on. It also doesn't interfere with your workflow, and there are a couple other advantages. On the other hand, it's a bit harder to see the results online. So to run a test on GitHub, you edit your code and you commit it to GitHub. That's it. In GitHub, and technical jargon here, you go to the repository's Actions tab and see how your tests are doing. You click on the test to see its summary page, and you should see the report. First, I'll show you actually the summary page here and where you can download the artifacts. And you can see the report in the console. Okay, setting up for GitHub is a bit more complicated. Please don't take a picture of this QR code. Again, that's all right. So it also, the setup interview is one we've created for you, and that will be linked at the end. And in the documentation, it takes you through setting up step by step, including creating that first test, does the interview load? And now we're going to see some more useful steps. What more? But Michelle, I hear you cry. ALKiln can load an interview. Isn't that enough? Well, shucks, folks. We thought we could do just a little bit more. So, first of all, you can have multiple files in an interview, multiple tests. Next, you can fill in fields with answers. I fill in this field with this answer. And I'm running out of time. So I'll show you how the text in the test actually reflects your code in docassemble. First, like before, the first step starts the interview at letter.yaml. Then we add a step to fill in the text field. Someone's first name. It broadly says, I set the first user's name to Mary. So let's go over this step a bit more slowly. The first command, and I set the variable, and then the variable name, our custom part. So quote user0.name.first, the first user's first name, and then the second part of the command, to, and last comes, in quotes, Mary. Given I set the variable users 0.name.first to quote Mary. And now the sky's the limit. The world is your oyster. You can fill in the first name. You can fill in the last name. You can have ALKiln check off plumbing as the housing problem for Mary. And because we use variable names to identify the fields, the tests are flexible. You can mess with the actual text of the interview as much as you want, and the tests will still pass. It may not sound like a big deal, but it's really very clever, and you're just gonna have to take my word for it. Like any code, you do have to get the words and the syntax right. But if you know your variable names, you can write these tests. Okay. So it does more than filling in fields, and I'll try to run that really quickly because there's no time. Okay.
I have a 15-minute break minute, so no. Yeah,
Oh, there's a 15-minute. So there's questions for 5 minutes after this. Great. All right. So this step checks for the question ID to make sure we're on the right page. And the question ID is, that's the command, and then our custom text download screen. Here it's username, so that's silly, but there you go. The download step lets you download a file. Then I download letter to landlord. And you can sign with a name so that you can make sure your signatures in the PDFs are ending up in the right places. I sign with the name, quote, Autumn. I should see the phrase interim child support. This makes sure that the text that you intended the user to see is the text that they are seeing. And this has caught several logic errors that we've run into in the past. And I take a screenshot. If you want something to confirm something visually, you can take a screenshot, and then the cherry on top, accessibility, developed by our own Bryce Willey, gets a lot of mentions in these spaces, that tests basic accessibility compliance. It tries to start addressing the same kinds of issues that I think Jessica and Regis talked about yesterday. It can't replace the work they do manually, but it gets some of the basics. For each page, it'll report if it saw any accessibility issues that it registered and what they were. So this is a lot of information, a lot to learn. We're continuing to make this smoother, make this easier to use, and we love to hear from our users. So this is what ALKiln can take off your shoulders so that you can build the trust your users need when they're facing some of their most painful struggles. And now I'm going to wait an awkward amount of time for potential questions.
Check that line, and any online.
Do you have one? Yes.
So if you have multiple YAML files, it's still gonna work. You just have to initiate the first one to get the testing started.
Michelle, if you could repeat the questions for the folks online.
Sure. So if you say sorry.
So if the questions are in multiple files,
Yes.
then, and you mentioned that you have to say where we're gonna start
Right,
the file.
right.
That's all you have to do. You don't have to mention
The other files.
the other files.
So if we mention the first file, do we have to mention the other files? Nope, because all it's doing is like a user, like you do, it goes to that link and it runs that interview. All the files are still included, just like, you know, the normal workflow. That would be very painful, yes.
Michelle, do you want to explain? I know you probably had to cut it for time, a little bit about like the story tables and the random input testing, just to mention they exist.
Okay, well, random input testing is a coming feature. It's still in experimental mode, where the test you can write one step to try to get through your interview all the way from beginning to end without any errors by inserting random input into the fields with a good faith effort. So it's going to try to answer the questions in the way it thinks they were intended to be answered. And that way, it's not a very targeted system, but it might be able to, if you run it like, you know, a dozen times, you might be able to catch something if you don't have time to write the actual tests. It's a little bit of a guard. If there are other questions, I'd like to answer those before going into story tables. But if not, I actually have slides ready for that. So, does anybody are there any questions online?
That was in the chat.
Oh, okay. Good, because I closed my laptop.
Michelle,
Yes, Matt.
can you install ALKiln on its own? Do you need to install any other assembly line packages that you're not using them?
You can you use assembly line? I mean, can you use ALKiln without assembly line? No, this was developed in collaboration with and alongside assembly line, so it has some special steps that work just for assembly line, but you don't have to have assembly line at all, just with any docassemble interview.
You recommend creating the questions as you create the interview, because if you have like long interview, it's pretty hard to go back and try
to create the test at the same time.
Yeah.
So the question is, do we recommend creating the tests along with the interview? Because when you have a ton of variables at the end, then it's hard to go back and, I wonder if I can get there. Probably can't get there, to go back and list all your variables. So that's very true. We actually created a tool that will let you use the end of your interview. You can go to the end of an interview, get all the JSON variables, which I'll show in another presentation, paste them into an input field, and get out what Quentin was talking about, which is a story table test that will do its best effort to list all your variables. And then you're going to have to, depending on your interview, make some changes to polish it up, but it'll do the brunt of the work. But I don't recommend starting the tests from the beginning. Maybe you can make some files and call them .text until you're ready to make them .feature files, or store them elsewhere. Maybe that's a better option, because as you develop your code, you're going to change variable names. You're going to add questions in the middle, and the tests are going to fail. Let's put it this way. If you're not worried about getting failing tests, like if you're not worried about the red X's on GitHub, or if you don't need to test locally and you're going to not test locally, actually that may be a really good idea. So I've changed my mind. So there you go. Other questions? And should I finish, or?
I think we just show people like what the story table
Looks like. Okay, so the basic thing is, if you use these linear steps, when you change the order of your questions, you're going to have to change the order of your test, and you're going to have to update all your tests, even if you have a bunch of them. So this is called a story table, and it won't care what order your questions are in. You just list in 3 columns the variable name, the value, and then ignore this 3rd column for now. If you end up needing that, talk to me. So we can have another conversation. So yes, actually they're way at the end, so I don't know if I can get there. But this is the basics of a story table test, and it does make the test more flexible and make your the interviews easier to update and need less updates in the tests. Good? Does that mean anything to anybody? All right. Okay. Very cool.
Okay, let's take a break and reconvene at 10:05 for the DocAssemble showcase presentation. So I'll have time to grab some coffee